turn the floor over to Marva to discuss the DHAP program and application tips and tricks. It's all yours, Marva.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So I am happy to be here today and happy that all of you have been able to join us. Please forgive me. I was sick last week, and so I'm still having a little bit of trouble with talking, so just bear with me. So we'll start out with a little bit about the history of DHAP and what DHAP is. So DHAP was created in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic initially started. The federal government realized that there were tenants that were out of work and were unable to work. And so they were unable to pay rent and important things like utilities. So they distributed money throughout the states, and Delaware was fortunate to get a large amount of funding. And that funding was through ERA-1 and ERA-2 funding. And that money was specifically for tenants to be able to apply for rental assistance and for utility assistance. It could be due to their place of employment being shut down, loss of hours, if they had to take leave for a sick family member due to COVID, or if they were just having some other financial hardships related to COVID-19. So the eligibility requirements for the tenant, the eligible households must have had qualified for unemployment. And then there's been a couple iterations of this program. So in the very first one, we required that that tenant have applied for unemployment and approved for unemployment. We've since moved from there, so those requirements have somewhat changed. So they have to have qualified for unemployment, or they have to show that they've reduced an reduction in income, and or that they are at risk of homelessness, or they have a housing instability. Basically, their rent is 30% more of their monthly income. And then they also need to meet the income requirements of the program. And we can verify those in several different manners. So the application process is relatively seamless. I know that there are challenges that have arisen throughout the process. But once you get the hang of it, it works out pretty well as long as you kind of know what's needed and what we're looking for. So initially, the way it starts is either the tenant or the landlord can submit an application. You would do that through our portal, and Lori can go ahead and put the website in the chat box for those of you that have not been on our portal yet. So either you or your tenant would submit an application. Once that application is submitted, if you, the landlord, are submitting it, your tenant will get an email, and then your tenant will need to complete their portion of the application. If your tenant applies prior to you applying, then you would get an email invite to log into the portal and update your information. Once all of that information is done and you've submitted everything, either the tenant or the landlord side is complete, that application is sent for an initial audit. And once that audit is done, it's then sent for a supervisory audit, and then that application is either approved or denied. So on the landlord side, there's a couple of documents that we're definitely going to need. One of those forms being the W-9 form, which can be found in the portal. And that W-9 form is to ensure that we're paying the landlord correctly. We're also going to need your direct deposit information. You have two options when being paid. You can choose direct deposit, or you can be paid check. And then we're going to make sure that we have information regarding the property, which would be the lease, and we're going to need your rent ledger and past due statements. So when we ask for a ledger, sometimes there's confusion because the DHAP program can be utilized for delinquent rent, current rent, and future rent. So we do have some landlords or tenants that are applying and they're not past due yet. So when we ask for a ledger, it doesn't have to show that that tenant is past due in order for them to qualify. It's basically going to be a ledger of what payments that tenant have made or what payments are due. And we have a sample ledger that you can find on our website as well. So if your tenant has questions, they can go to our website, our decovidhousinghelp.com website. That's also where they're going to go in order to apply for the program, and that's where you would go. We also have a call center number, and that's our 866-935-0407 number. And I would definitely write that down because that's the number that our landlords and our tenants would call. And we also have community navigators. And what our community navigators are organizations throughout the state that assist tenants with applying for the DHAP assistance. And those community navigators can meet some of the tenants on site. So they may be able to go and meet them where they are, or they may schedule for that tenant to come into their office and bring the required documents. And that navigator really does all of the legwork with getting that application submitted to us, and making sure that those things get sent over to the landlords for their portion. So some of the statuses that we've had questions over statuses, kind of what do they mean? Where is my application when it's in this status? So our in progress, I'll kind of start at the bottom. Our in progress, it means that it's kind of started. So the review process has started. An auditor can take a look at it and kind of make sure that all of the documents there are there on the landlord side and the tenant. An auditor can either assign it to call outreach completed, and that means that there's something that's required. We haven't gotten it back yet. We're not denying the application yet, but it's kind of just hanging out there until either the landlord or tenant responds to our communications regarding what is needed. And so that would be our call outreach completed. Applied status means that they've basically applied. You'll see that they're either invited or it's in progress. So invited means that either the landlord or the tenant has done their portion and the other side has been invited and hasn't gone in and done their portion yet. And in progress kind of means that it's kind of in progress and hasn't been completed yet. Once we get to a denied status, so if we've taken a look at the case, and we don't have everything that we need, we've made multiple outreaches, we'll deny no appeal allowed. And that means that either your tenant's going to go in and do a new case, or the landlord can go in and do a new case, because the case that we have, we've either denied it. And if it's denied due to eligibility, then at that time, probably you would not be doing a new case, because we've determined that either the tenant is ineligible, the property is ineligible, or there's a multitude of reasons why that case could have been denied. We do have an appealed status, but we no longer use that. That was where the tenant could go in and appeal, but it kind of just sat out there. So we've done the denied no appeal allowed, which allows that tenant to not appeal that case, but to potentially go in and submit a new case. Our denied cases, again, are usually denied because they're not eligible for some reason. And like I said, they can appeal that by going in and submitting a new case. Our paid status is once that case has been approved, it'll flip over to paid status, and it gets sent to the bank. And then approved for payment is kind of, we've approved that case, it's approved for payment. We're just waiting till we approve that batch, and it flips over to paid status so that you'll see it on your end and can anticipate that you'll be either getting that direct deposit or that check. Really quickly, one of the other assignments that you'll see is DSHA auditor. Towards the end of this slide, you'll see some contact information. If you see that your case has been assigned as a DSHA auditor case, that means that you need to reach out to DSHA because there's some additional information, or maybe there's some questions that we have related to your case that can't be answered by email. We just need some more information directly from either the tenant or the landlord. So we would recommend that you call DSHA directly for those. All right, and this is kind of a screenshot of when you go in and you're applying in the portal. On the left-hand side, I want you to take notice of the blue check marks. A blue check mark means that that particular spot that you've been in, you've done everything that needs to be done. If you see a yellow triangle, that means that there's still information required. So if you see a yellow triangle, that means we need more information from you. If you look towards the middle of the portal, you can see statuses. So the ones that we just talked about, we have your in progress, we have your submitted, We have your not started. So those are all different things that you need to pay attention to. And then you'll see the unassigned, you'll see a name. We see Kemi Yu in there. She's one of the auditors. But keep in mind that there is no way for you to really email your auditor. If an auditor or a supervisor sends you an email and they include their email address in there, that means that they're probably looking for some direct interaction from you and need you to send them something directly, or they're asking you a specific question. Most often, though, if you get an email from an auditor or a supervisor, it will come from a do not reply email, which means if you're replying to that email and you're submitting documents to that email instead of through the portal, those documents aren't going anywhere, and those questions or your answers are not going anywhere. So your best bet is either to go into the portal, upload those documents, or call that 800 our call center number if you have additional questions as to what we are requesting. So some of the reminders. So, most of the landlord questions that we get are related to how long does it take for an application to be approved? And there's no real answer to that because there's a lot of back and forth that maybe you don't even see. So you may have submitted an application as the landlord. You've given us everything we need, and we've been reaching out to your tenant to try to get information, and we haven't gotten it. Or it could be that the tenant submitted an application and they've submitted everything that we need, but we're really reaching out to the landlord because we need additional information. So there's a lot of back and forth on these applications until we get everything we need. But we're going to go over some tips to how to get this application at least passed on the landlord side right away. What are the things that we're looking for? So make sure that your tenant has the correct email address. Quite often we'll get an application and we'll need something from, like we'll get something from the tenant. Like the tenant will submit an application and they put the landlord information in there, and we're emailing you and we're saying we need information from you, and we're not getting a response from you. Most of the time it's because the tenant has given us an incorrect information for the landlord. There's no way that we're going to know that. So at the end of the day, that case may be denied, no appeal allowed, because we're going to say this landlord has not responded to any of our requests for information. So it's very important. Some of our larger landlords and even some of our smaller landlords have created forms that they give to their tenants that say, hey, when you're applying for DHAP, this is the contact information, this is the company name, this is the email address, and this is the person in our office that handles DHAP applications. So that's something that you might try to try to get those applications to move through a little faster. If you're working with a property management company, we're going to need that property management agreement uploaded along with that W-9, because what happens is when we get a case, we're checking the property records. So we're going to look at a parcel search. If the parcel search does not match the application of who's listed as landlord, that's going to get kicked back, or we're going to ask for a property management agreement. So best practices are, if you're a property manager or if you have a property management agreement, just go ahead and upload that with each of your cases. The other thing we want to talk about is that EIN number, your bank account number, and your social security number. So when entering information into the portal, you're going to want to make sure that your EIN number correctly matches the name that you registered your business with the IRS. We do a TIN check, and if the EIN number gets kicked back, most often it's because the information you listed on the W-9 form and the information you typed into the portal don't exactly match how you registered your company. We've had the IRS kick them back for something as simple as, a comma being missing or a capitalization. So make sure that you look at those documents of how you registered your company and make sure that your W-9 and the information for your business is entered in exactly as such. Your bank account information. You're going to get, if you're putting your bank account information, you're going to get a small deposit. You're going to have to verify. Make sure you go back in and verify that deposit. And your social security number. So, as odd as it may seem, we've had, folks put in a social security number. They may have transposed numbers. So the IRS is kicking it back as an incorrect match for that name and social security number. So before you hit the submit on your applications, go back in and check all of that information to make sure it's accurate. Verifying your banking information. For example, I just had a case today that I was working on, and it got kicked back because the landlord mistakenly put their email address in the information or in the portion where we would be submitting a check to that individual. So make sure that everything is in the right place. And the other thing is that rent ledger. So if you submit a case, and let's say the case takes a month to get reviewed and approved because we're going back and forth with your tenant, or maybe we have some challenges on the landlord side with documents, you're going to want to make sure that you put a new ledger in there. So if you submitted it this month, and we're in August, and you've submitted your ledger for August, if the case hasn't been approved by September, my recommendation is on September 1st, go ahead and put your September ledger in there, because we don't want to take additional time reaching back out to you for that September ledger, because we want to make sure that everything that we can pay is on the most recent ledger in your application. So my recommendation to landlords is every month for all of your cases, if you think, if you can, if you have the ability to do that, make sure you've uploaded your most recent ledger. So I know that a lot of people on this call are here because they've heard the rumor that there are going to be some program changes, and I've kind of hinted it around to them. And I think, our newsletters and potentially our website may have alluded to the fact that there are changes happening. And yes, there are. So some of those program changes are due to our funding sources. So we have till the end of September to spend our ERA1 funding. And some of you have been made aware of this because since we pay future rent, Treasury has made it very clear that we can only pay ERA1 funds through to the end of September. So some landlords now, since we're paying future rent, you're getting 2 checks because we're only able to pay October and November rent with ERA2 funds. So you may have seen some, maybe 2 checks coming in for a case because we've had to pay on 2 different funding streams. So as we move into ERA2 funding, which is the end of our funding for this COVID assistance program, that funding is through till 2025. And what we're doing is we're wanting to make sure that we have enough funding to really hit the highest need, highest risk populations. And we want that funding to last through till 2025. And in doing that, what we've made a decision to do is we're going to increase some of our documentation requirements. So currently, tenants have been able to submit applications and just kind of fill out an income attestation form that basically states, this is my income. We really want to see what income brackets people are in. And so we are going back to the way it was initially when tenants had to submit proof of income. So we'll be looking at pay stubs, we'll be looking at either tax returns, awards letters, the things that we did initially. We are also decreasing the income limits. So right now we're at 80% median income, and we'll be reducing the income limits to lower, and we'll be announcing those in the near future. We'll also be capping the amount of program assistance that's distributed. So currently we're an up to 18-month program, and we pay up to $2,000 a month in rent, and that rental amount will be changing as well. And again, these changes are happening because of our federal U.S. Treasury program guidelines, and we're moving again from one funding stream to another one. So how do those changes affect you as the landlord? So we are going to, and I know some of you have been around for a long time, so you may have recalled when we closed the portal, last year. And that kind of happened suddenly, and we don't want that to happen again. And that happened due to some other circumstances. But currently what we've made a decision to do is we will be doing a portal pause, and that will be coming in the next couple weeks. So we will not be accepting applications for a period of time. And that will allow us to work through all of the applications that are in the portal that we need to get paid out on that ERA1 funding. And then we can reopen in October and start allocating those ERA2 funds with the new qualifications of the program guidelines. So the existing applications during that portal pause, we will continue to work through them. Our goal is to get through all of them, and if not all of them, as many as possible. And when we reopen the portal, then the applications that we review would be held to the new guidelines. We will still be able to process emergency applications, and those would be done through our community navigators. When I say an emergency application, those would be for folks that have a utility shutoff, or they have an eviction date in the court. So we would still be able to process those through community navigators. And how can you stay up to date? So like I said, we're going to announce some of these dates and the specifics to our changes regarding, the changes to income and rent. So I would recommend that you visit our website regularly and to continue to attend these biweekly landlord calls. And now we will open for questions. Lori, you can kind of explain the question and answer process.
Awesome, yes. So we will begin with the questions that were submitted through the registration form. There were some repeats, so they have been consolidated just for time management. And they have also been categorized. So we will start with application and portal questions. Why do I keep being asked for the same materials or documents over and over?
So that's a hard question to answer. I kind of need to know what specific documents you're being asked for. But generally, when we ask for a document repeatedly, it's because the document that's being submitted does not meet the requirements. If it's a form, there may be a box that wasn't checked correctly. If it's a ledger, the ledger may not have all of the information that is required for us to process that application. My recommendation is that if you're being repeatedly asked for something, to contact the call center and ask for a breakdown or an explanation of exactly what was incorrect with the document that you submitted.
Okay, thank you. And what actions can a landlord take for an application that has not been reviewed in many weeks?
So what I would recommend that you do is have a conversation with your tenant and make sure that that tenant has submitted everything that's needed, and make sure that there's nothing that we've requested from the tenant that they haven't submitted. Again, quite often what we find is that we're reaching out to a tenant. We might have the incorrect email address, so those emails are going unanswered, or we could potentially have a tenant that's really not responding to our request for information, and or that tenant is submitting documents and those documents are not complete or are inaccurate. So really having open communication with your tenant.
Okay. Is there a way to see the date a case has been paid or the payment status?
So yes, you should be able to go, and it's again, this is really dependent on how you've set yourself up in the portal. And I am not as up to speed on the IT portion of it. So depending on how you're set up, whether you're set up as an admin or a reviewer, you should be able to go under that tenant and see whether they've been paid or not. Or if you have questions, you can contact the call center and they should be able to tell you as well.
Okay. How can I remove a tenant or an application that has been denied?
You can't. So that kind of stays there forever. It's really to give us as an agency and Treasury an idea of how many applications are being submitted, how many are being denied, why they're being denied. So it kind of sits out there, and there's not much we can do about that.
Okay, so we will transition to tenant-related questions. Why are some tenants approved faster than others when I have had multiple submit on the same day or the same week?
So that's a good question. And what I can say is that we have auditors and supervisors all across the country, right? So it kind of depends on how much that auditor has in their caseload, who it's sent to. And also, I mean, we could have if it's submitted, there may be documents that are missing on the tenant side, or we may be having some sort of conversation back and forth with your tenant. But again, it's not one person that's assigned to all of your cases. It could be somebody that has a larger or a smaller caseload. So kind of it's just dependent on when that case comes into queue for them to review.
When applying, excuse me, how can a tenant or landlord change or update information? For instance, if there was an increase in rent.
So if there's an increase in rent, what that landlord would want to do is submit the signed document that both the tenant and the landlord have signed that shows the date of when that rental increase occurred. And the auditor and supervisor should be able to look at that. I would also recommend that the landlord update their ledger. So for example, let's say the rent was 800 last month, but in September, or let's say it's 800 this month, and September it's increasing to 900. I would do a letter that basically states, along with, the signed documentation, that as of September 1st, the rent has been increased to whatever that increased amount is, and ask them to please review the signed documentation from the landlord and the tenant. I will say, if you're submitting a case and you have something a little bit different going on in it, a letter of explanation is always recommended to kind of explain why the rent maybe went from 800 to 900, or whatever that change might be. For example, if you've now, you're on a month-to-month lease, you haven't re-signed a lease necessarily, but you've changed, what the requirements are. We need to make sure that the landlord and the tenant both agree to that. So we would need something signed by both parties.
Okay. What happens if you go through the court process and receive possession prior to DHAP being approved?
So then DHAP, we would deny your case, because when you go into the portal, you're basically signing off that you will not evict that tenant if you receive DHAP funds.
And will DHAP pay rent for a tenant who left the unit without paying their past due rent?
So that's a yes and no. So technically we will not, if the tenant has left the unit, we need something from the tenant. I mean, if they're not living there, we're not going to pay the rent. And that tenant has the ability to move to a different unit and utilize the program. So, I mean, it's a hard question to answer. It kind of depends on when the application is approved, and what sort of conversation we've had with that tenant. I have had some tenants that have said, I am moving out of the unit. I would like you to pay my landlord because I don't want to have a judgment. And I'm fine with that happening. So it's kind of the interpretation of what that landlord and tenant agree to.
Okay, so we will move into the program information questions. What happens to money that is not utilized by evicted tenants? So a tenant received, or they were approved for the program, received the money, but then it evicted. I think
So, yeah, if you've evicted a tenant, let's say we've paid you money, and now that the tenant has been evicted and we've paid you 3 months of future rent, you would return that money to DSHA.
how many times can someone apply for DHAP assistance?
So we are up to an 18-month program, and we approve in 3-month increments of future rent. So they could apply one time if they're 18 months delinquent, and we'll look at everything, and they could, be approved and they're done with the program. Or they could apply and never have used the program and not be delinquent. And then they would recertify every 3 months until they maxed out of those 18 months of assistance, as long as they're eligible for the program at the time that they recertify.
Okay. And if a landlord does not want to participate for whatever reason, can a tenant still apply for DHAP?
So yes, the tenant can still apply for DHAP. If the landlord is refusing to participate in the program, we would need a document signed by the landlord that basically says they're not willing to participate, and we would need a copy of a ledger, and then we would be able to pay the tenant directly. Those cases get additional review though, so additional documents may be required in order to approve that for direct tenant pay.
Okay, so we'll transition to the questions in the Q&A and chat box now. The first question, The answer was also placed in the chat, but are we able to get copies of the slides shared today so that we can share them with our team? And that is a yes. These slides will be sent out as well as the recording of this call in the follow-up email. Next question. As a tenant, can I apply for October, November, and December rent assistance now before changes go into effect?
So it's really dependent on how many months we've already paid out to you. Right now, we're not paying December rents. We're paying October, November, and we haven't started paying December rents at this time.
When we call DSHA, who do we ask for when our case says DSHA auditor?
So when you call DSHA, you'll just say that you're calling regarding your DHAP, and that it was in DSHA auditor status, and then they will send you to, I mean, we have a team here, and so it's kind of dependent on who's available at the time. They'll kind of see who's available for you to speak to.
Will the portal be able to show what is still missing on the tenant side if you're a landlord?
So I don't know if that question is, or as the landlord, can you see what's missing on the tenant side? And that would be a no. You're going to, again, have to have that good communication with your tenant and find out if there are things that are missing. You can also contact the call center, and the call center should be able to look at the notes and say, hey, on this date, we sent a request to your tenant for these documents.
With the upcoming funding changes, are utilities, water/electric still eligible?
So utilities we will still be paying utilities that are in the tenant's name. That is not changing as of yet. And so if it's a utility that the landlord pays, when we decide what the max rents are. So for example, if we said the max rent was X amount and your water supersedes that amount, it would just pay the max amount of rent. And so your tenant would be responsible for whatever's remaining, whether it was a portion of the rent or a portion of utility that they're required to pay.
Okay, so bit of a technical question, but I am registered as an admin with my email address, but need to change to a user so that I can work in applications. But I cannot because my email is already assigned to admin. What's some advice there?
Yeah, so I would definitely reach out. So you can contact the call center and let them know that you need them to put in a ticket for you to get that changed. So they'll move that to their IT department. That's something that on my side I can't do. I don't have the ability to go in and make those changes. So that's something the call center could probably help you with.
Okay. We have received applicants saying that they are in the DHAP program, and when asked how so, they say their rent is covered by DHAP. Is this a new program that we are offering?
So no, this program has been around since 2020, and there is no such thing as people are in the their rent is definitely being paid by DHAP. We are not like a Section 8 program. We're not a voucher program. There's no guarantees. So every person that applies has to go through the same process as anybody else. They apply. We look to see if they're eligible for the program. And I mean, I've had some landlords that connect with me and they're like, hey, we have somebody that's moving in. They say that they are DHAP eligible. And what we found sometimes is that, yes, they were DHAP eligible and they've been paid out 18 months. So they're no longer DHAP eligible. So, I mean, again, it's up to 18 months in 3-month increments, and it's whether they're eligible or not at the time that they apply.
What is the maximum amount one tenant can request?
So the maximum amount of rent that we pay currently is $2,000 per month. The maximum amount of payments we can make in this program is 18 months of payments. So if we have somebody that's asking for delinquent rent, we can pay the delinquent rent, we would pay the current rent, and typically we pay up to 3 months of future rent.
And it is important to note that the max amount a tenant can receive will change with these program changes. Um, can one tenant apply again if they've already received money earlier?
Again, yes, as long as they haven't maxed out of the 18 months of payments.
How can tenants find DHAP landlord property managers with units available?
So this is a question that I'm asked every day, and I have the same answer. I don't think there's any such thing as a DHAP landlord or property manager. I mean, landlords and property managers determine who's going to be living in their units by whatever method they typically use. And it's up to that specific property manager or landlord as to whether they participate in the DHAP program. At DSHA, we are the entity that disperses those funds. So we really have no, there's nothing that we do one-on-one with landlords to say, yes, we're going to sign you up and you have to accept DHAP. That's not how it works. There's no listing anywhere to my knowledge, and not under DSHA at least, that says these are landlords and property managers that accept DHAP. It's kind of up to the property manager and landlord to set their own guidelines.
Can a tenant that had COVID during July 2022 but did not have delinquent rent be eligible for assistance?
So yeah, I mean, so here's the thing. Right now, there is a COVID hardship form that tenant needs to complete. If they read through that form and they're able to answer the questions accordingly, then, we're not looking to get a note from your doctor that you had COVID and what the dates are. The COVID hardship form basically states that, you were affected, you had a hardship due to COVID. And that hardship has to have been as of March of 2020.
Okay. So I do see your question, Ashley. We did answer it, but are happy to go over it again, which is when we call DSHA, who do we ask for when our case says DSHA auditor? So what you'll do is you'll tell the person on the phone, our front desk receptionist, that you have a DHAP case and has the status DSHA auditor. It is then that we will direct you to a member of the DHAP team. We do not have a specific person you can ask for, but as long as you say, my case has a DSHA auditor status, we will get you to the right person. Next question. Will a tenant that had COVID during July 2022, missed work, and experienced loss of income be eligible for assistance?
So currently, as the program is now, they are eligible.
Okay, and then I see Stephanie. I'll try and find your question again. Besides being approved after an eviction took place, what would be some other examples of landlords having to send back DHAP money for tenants?
So I think the only example that I can really think of is that the tenant has just not renewed. There was a non-renewal, and there wasn't an eviction, and both parties agreed to the non-renewal. We paid future 3 months rent, but the tenant has since moved into a different unit, someplace else. So that might be another example of why you might send money back. And as an example, like we've had cases where we've paid 3 months of future rent. The tenant has moved out, both parties have agreed to that, and then the tenant comes in and wants to apply for rental assistance for their new unit. We are not able to approve that until their landlord returns the money from their previous unit.
Okay.
And returning funds, if you need to return funds, you would, again, just call DSHA and somebody at the front desk will let you know who to mail the check to.
Okay. With this new program, will applications still be allowed to be submitted and approved for those who have future move-in dates?
Yeah, so that's not changing. I mean, we haven't made a change to that in this at this point. We would still be assisting with security deposit. And again, we don't necessarily need a lease for that future person to move in. We would need the welcome letter. That welcome letter would need to include their move-in date, their name, the property address, the unit number, how much is the security deposit would be, how much the agreed upon monthly rent is, and what is needed for move-in. So if it's a prorated, I know some landlords, if you're moving in like on the 15th, then they just make your rent due the 15th of each month. Some landlords do 15, divided into 30 days and they prorate the rent. So just make sure that your welcome letter basically says exactly, what is required for that tenant to move in.
Can we delete the tenants that have been paid multiple times?
No, you're stuck with them forever. They're there. It's part of the portal. I get a lot of calls about that. They're like, look, we've seen this name in here, there. They've been maxed out on 18 months. How do we get them out of our system? We can't take them out because we do have to keep reporting. This is a program that potentially can be audited. So we want to make sure that we have as much information as possible. And, there are times that we have tenants that will go someplace else and, to another unit and they'll apply. We still need to be able to have access to their application to see how many months that they've been paid on at other properties.
How long before a case is denied?
That's a good. I can't even give you a real answer on that because the technically the way the auditors work are 7 days, 3 outreach attempts. So they make 3 outreach attempts in 7 days. And if there's no response within those 7 days, they can put that case in call outreach completed. And it kind of just sits there until either the landlord or the tenant uploads documents, or potentially they can deny no appeal, allow it after those 7 days. I know from my internal DSHA staff, we allow a little bit longer for that. And that's something I didn't really talk about. So for our internal staff, we do have internal DSHA staff. I have a team here that kind of works on cases that need to be escalated. So we have a staff member that works on any case that has a court hearing and needs some sort of escalation. We have a team member that works on the larger landlords. The larger landlords that are on this call are probably familiar with Brenda Stevenson. She works on those large landlord issues. Reem Alicia works on our court stuff. Daba is on our call. Daba Maximore, she manages all of our community navigators. Best practices, I always tell my landlords, if you have a tenant that needs to apply for assistance, send them to a community navigator, because the community navigator will get that application submitted. They know what's needed, and then they're the direct point of contact between the auditor, supervisor, and that tenant. The tenant doesn't have to do anything other than answer the call to the navigator. The navigator gets us everything that we need. So I definitely am really pushing community navigators because they're your best point of attack if you have a tenant that is struggling with either getting a case submitted because maybe they don't have access to a computer. You can submit the application on your cell phone, but sometimes that cell phone does not allow you to do as much as you need it to. So again, a community navigator is going to be your best point of contact to get those harder applications through and reviewed quickly. There
And
is a list of community navigators on the DHAP website, and Lori, I'm sure we'll put that in the chat, or you can put that, if you go to our website, it says application assistance on there. If you click on that, I'm on there all day long because I'm always sending that link to people. We have some really great navigators. And the thing that I really like about our community navigators is that they will work with a tenant on their DHAP application, but they also are able to recognize if that tenant needs additional resources. So they may be able to help them with some additional resources, which is really nice as well.
Yep, and I did just place that link to the community navigators in the chat.
Thanks, Lori.
So how do we return funds?
I think I saw earlier in the chat there was somebody typed in to return those to Lisa McNatt in our office. If you scroll through the chat, I think that was in there.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure I saw it, but maybe that was.
Okay. Can landlords decline to accept DHAP funds after an application has been approved?
What was the question again?
Can landlords decline to accept DHAP funds after an application has been approved?
So if the landlord has already gone through and done everything and they've agreed to receive those funds, if the funds are dispersed, like it's approved and I process the batch, there's nothing you can do at that point. I mean, you can return the funds and say that you're not willing to take them. But that's completely up to the landlord. But there is a certain point that we get in the case where once it's been approved for payment, and I've processed that payment, there's nothing we can do.
Um, during the beginning of DHAP funding, during the beginning of the DHAP funding period, utilities were denied. Are water bills included as part of the monthly rent?
So here's the thing with utility bills. So we pay utility bills directly uploaded by the tenant that are in the tenant's name. If a utility bill is in the landlord's name, we can pay it as long as the lease says that the tenant is responsible for payment of that utility. We would not pay it directly to the utility vendor. We would pay it to the landlord, and the landlord would need to include that on their ledger. So in its example, if your rent is $1,200 a month and they have a $50 water bill, and you would submit the ledger that says 1,200 rent, $50 water. The auditor is going to check the lease. If the lease says yes, the tenant is responsible for making those payments, then we would pay that water bill money or that utility money directly to the landlord. But again, that lease is going to have to show that the tenant is responsible for paying the utilities. And it doesn't matter to us whether they're responsible for paying it directly to the utility provider or the landlord. Our assumption is if the utilities are in the landlord's name, the landlord is probably paying those on their own and is looking for reimbursement. And that check would go, it wouldn't be a separate check. It would be one check that is made payable to the landlord that includes what was on that ledger in the form of whether it was rent, water bill, or if there was a court fee or something, it's one lump sum payment for that month. So we're kind of paying out specifically to what's on that ledger.
Okay. How does the process work for those interested in mortgage assistance, and has the process changed? So our Delaware Mortgage Relief Program is a separate program from DHAP. It launched earlier this summer, and I'm happy to include the website information into the chat. It is a different process than the DSHA's DMAP program. So in that sense, yes, the process has changed.
So I did put my email address in the chat box. And if you send me emails, and I'm not going to guarantee that I'm going to always be the one working on resolving your issue. If it's an issue related to a specific case, then we'll either bump that back to the auditor or the supervisor. But if it's a programmatic question that you have, I typically can get you answers to those pretty quickly.
How can I find out what month the tenant was paid up to?
So you can contact the call center and ask, but typically we're paying 3 months in advance. So it's kind of we're looking at the last payment would be what was on that ledger, and then 3 months from that, the date of the last payment that you included on that was paid on your ledger.
Can a landlord and tenant both have access to their portal using their own credentials? I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's asking if the landlord and tenant can see each other's side of the application.
No, they can't, because here's the thing. The tenant has the ability to put their social security number in there. The landlord, I mean, I don't know about all of the rest of the landlords on here, but if I was a landlord, I really don't want my tenant having access to all my banking information. So that's why they are not able to see each other's side, because there's a lot of personal information on both sides that maybe one or the other parties should not have access to.
How can a landlord determine why a tenant was denied?
I would contact the call center. And usually there should be enough notes in there that would let them know why they were denied.
Could you go over the manager non-renewal process again? If a tenant is currently on manager non-renewal, but then their application winds up being approved, are landlords required to accept that money?
So here's what the landlord can do. The landlord, because you're not evicting them and it's a non-renewal, you can keep the money through to the date that that tenant moves out. So my recommendation would be, if you're going to do a non-renewal, and I think it gets kind of crazy for us because in Delaware, we're like this, as soon as your lease ends, it's assumed that it's a month lease. So we don't look at that end date on the lease. I mean, I have leases that are like 7 years old and we're still paying out on them because the landlord and tenant never re-signed a new lease. And the assumption is it's a month. If you have a non-renewal, my recommendation is that you submit your ledger through to the dates that you want paid. And you also write on that ledger, and you can also upload a letter that basically says this is going to be a non-renewal and that future months of rent are not required, that you're only looking for payment of rent through till their move out month of whatever that month might be.
Okay, so we have some clarification on returning funds. Marva has placed her email in the chat, but you can also call the DSHA main number and let the front desk know that you are calling about returning a payment, and it will direct you to our accounting team.
And I will say, if you're returning a payment, what you're going to want to do is make sure that when you're sending that check in, that you are putting the case number and the tenant number and for which months you are returning those payments. Because it can get a little messy because the tenant, now that we put that money back on the books for them, so now they have those months back. If you don't determine or let us know what months you're returning the payments for, it can be a little bit confusing for both the tenant and for our team.
Okay, so we are now at 3:55, and I just wanted to quickly say we'll keep answering questions, but if we do not get to your question today, we will be sending a follow-up email that will capture the Q&A and have some responses for those that were not asked. So the next question, I just received an approval for payment. Can you decline a specific resident for our community?
I'm not really sure what that means.
Yeah, if you could
Like,
provide
if you've
more.
already approved the payment, then, I mean, just send me an email and give me some specifics and I can take a look at it.
Okay. And when dealing with a water bill, is the water a separate check?
No. Well, it depends. Again, if the water is in the tenant's name, then we're sending a separate check to the utility provider. If the water bill is in the landlord's name, then we're sending that portion of the water bill with the check that's inclusive of the rent that they requested.
If a tenant's monthly rent is over $2,000, how much rent gets paid? Does DHAP only cover $2,000 each month?
So currently we do cover up to the $2,000. And then if there's outstanding, like if they have a water bill or something, you can include that in your ledger. But I will say, with the program changes, when we reduce the maximum amount of rent, that will no longer be something that we do. So if the maximum amount of rent is a certain amount, it doesn't matter what is due. We're only paying a certain amount. And if there's court fees, if there's utility fees, then it's now up to your tenant to pay the portion of rent that's not covered under DHAP.
Should a tenant that is still behind contact DHAP even if they have not had COVID or a COVID-related hardship?
So I guess for me, I always say submit your application. And if we can approve it, we will. And if we can't, we won't. So I mean, I think it's best to have them, because sometimes the tenant is not explaining specifically what happened to them. So I think it's best to just have them submit an application, and then our auditing team can take a look and see if they meet the requirements. And again, since our requirements do change from funding, when we change funding, somebody that may not have been eligible before may be eligible now, or vice versa.
What's the difference between the mortgage assistance program and the DMAP program? So the major difference is there is a difference in funding. The mortgage relief program is funded by federal U.S. Treasury funds called the Homeowners Assistance Fund, and the DMAP program is funded by state funds. I will say that the DMAP program is not open or accepting applications right now, so the Delaware Mortgage Relief Fund is the best option for mortgage assistance. Let's see. If a tenant's rent was paid, but the tenant decided to move out before the funds run out, what happens to the funds? Does it go back to the tenant or does it go back to DHAP?
So it never goes back to the tenant. It always goes back to DHAP because again, we need to have an accounting. And keep in mind, like you're getting a 1099 at the end of the year. If you get that money and you pay it and you give it to the tenant, you're still getting a 1099 for that full amount that was sent to you. So my recommendation is, and what you're supposed to do is send it back to DSHA, so that we can adjust, what amount you actually received.
Okay. Just heard from a landlord friend that recent DHAP funding was dispersed in monthly increments. Is that situation still going?
Nope. What might have happened though, if they got like a single check, again, it could be the explanation that I said in the beginning, where we're switching from ERA 1 to ERA 2. We are not able to pay any rent past September with ERA 1 funding. So they may have gotten the check for, past due rent for with ERA 1, but then they may have gotten like a one payment for October as a single check because we had to switch the funding source on that.
If a tenant is suspected of submitting falsified documents or misrepresenting their hardship, should this be reported?
So, I mean, I think it kind of depends on what the misrepresentation is. I mean, I can't necessarily answer that. When we're auditing cases, there's specific documents that we ask for. And our assumption is that people are doing the right thing. If you have something that's blatantly wrong and you want to reach out to DSHA, you can. But we are limited into what, we have the ability to investigate and what we can investigate.
Okay, so the last two questions. As a landlord, how do I access old records?
So I think send me an email, because if they're records that were under your email address, you should be able to access them. If you had somebody else in your office that was working cases and they were under a different email address, then you may not be able to, and we'd have to kind of figure that out. So I can't give you a really solid answer on that unless I knew specifically what records you were referring to and what time frame. If they were from the old system, like if they were from Alita or something like that, and you have a question about an old case that was in Alita, you can contact DSHA and we can try to get you as much information as possible.
Okay. Can DHAP cover damages that the tenant may have caused and are planning to be charged for?
We cannot. We can only pay for rents and the associated costs of living for that tenant, whether it's a water bill, a utility bill. We currently pay insurance, like if insurance is included, we can pay those things, but we do not pay for damages.
And if a person is homeless, can they apply for assistance to obtain housing?
So they can apply for DHAP, but we can't do anything until they locate a unit. And the DHAP program is not set up to locate units for individuals. So in those circumstances, I highly recommend that you reach out to a community navigator, because the community navigators, some of them are working with landlords to find units. Not all of them, but some of those agencies are. So I would refer that individual to working with a community navigator.
Okay, so that was our last question for the afternoon. I just want to reiterate that these bi-weekly calls are the best way to stay up to date on program change information. The next call will be September 1st at 3 p.m. I am going to put the registration link in the chat now so that you can go ahead and save that on your calendars. Again, this meeting recording and the chat the questions from the chat will also be included in a follow-up email, which you will receive shortly. You can also check out previous landlord calls and future ones on the DE COVID Housing Help website. I just want to take a moment to thank Marva for an excellent presentation and for answering questions. I will stay on for a little bit to gather final information if you would like to send case numbers or have questions that I can refer you to the website for. If not, again, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we will talk to you soon.
Lori, I'll stay on with you in case there's any.
Okay. We do have one question. Would past due and unpaid rent for a tenant that has moved out in 2021 qualify through this program to be paid so that I can remove the judgment from their records?
Okay, can you say that to me again?
Yeah. Would past due and unpaid rents from the tenant that has moved out in 2021 qualify through this program to be paid so that I can remove the judgments?
No, the tenant would have to be living in the property at the time of the application.
Okay. So it looks like we're all good. Thank you, Marva.
All right.